downtown Eugene, we're seeing the predictable results of 40 years of land use planning that has frozen the urban growth boundary at one size, and gradually the housing has been becoming more and more dense to fill in that space with more and more people. Behind me is a 4-story apartment and retail building, and we have more construction starting over here across the street, as well as the skyline beginning to fill up with new apartment buildings behind us. And although I know it is some people's ideal way to live, it doesn't speak to me very well. There's a folk singer heart in me that wants to ask, where do the children play? As Cat Stevens, aka Yusuf Islam, would sing many years ago. So we have higher density, people living, hearing each other through walls or through ceilings and floors, and it's not really possible to relax as easily. Here on a winter's day like today, one can come out and brave the elements, get a little bit of rain. It's not as satisfying as going for a walk in the woods when it's green and the warmth of the woods is around you. It's just a different kind of life, a different kind of experience. And I think that it would be taking away from people's human experience to have only one alternative available, that is living in the city, as opposed to being able to grow and develop in nature among living things, among the natural world, and to develop that side of oneself that is closer to the earth, closer to nature. Hello, I'm Mark Baber, and I'm here at Lost Valley Educational Center to make a proposal that might take Lost Valley to a next level. As I have been on the board at Lost Valley in the past, and I'm currently on the board at Peace Village, I should make a disclaimer saying that this proposal is currently just in my own mind and has not been endorsed by the Lost Valley Education Center or Peace Village or Square One, although I'm kind of hoping that all three of these organizations will find this proposal to be of interest to them for various reasons, as we'll get into. The three organizations that form the structure of Peace Village, the original Peace Presbyterian Church that owned the land and operated as a nonprofit religious organization on the land, and then Square One Villages that came in and became the land trust, owning the land and leasing it to both the Housing Cooperative and Peace Presbyterian Church congregation. And then also the new organization, the Peace Village Housing Cooperative, which is made up of the residents, and it owns the residential buildings on the property and maintains those, and maintains all the agreements with the residents that are on the land there. And interestingly, this is a model that could be applied here at Lost Valley. So here's the current structure of Lost Valley. It is currently one nonprofit organization that owns the land, operates the educational center, and has residents. And I put this dashed red line in here to indicate the kind of aspirational aspects of these three elements that already exist as part of one nonprofit organization. So whereas here at Peace Village, we currently have 3 organizations and 3 boards. At Lost Valley, we have 1 board, 1 organization, 2 doing businesses as. On the legal paperwork, we're Willamette Cascades Community Land Trust, which reflects our aspiration to become a land trust. But the public mostly knows us as Lost Valley Education Center. LostValley.org is our website. For residents, we also have a body that meets every week or two called the Community Meetup, and Meadow Song Ecovillage has in the past been what we've called that group. In my view, the current organization at Lost Valley kind of anticipates the structure that has worked with Peace Village and other Square One projects. With some work, and I don't want to minimize the work, could be split into 3 organizations with 3 boards that would meet the requirements to funders and developers to create a housing cooperative in the model that Square One has successfully used in several other places. I wrote a paper about 2.5 years ago about some of the advantages that I've had observed living here at Lost Valley Education Center, and the reason I would propose that there be a new land use planning designation called rural residential clusters. Lost Valley can get by with its exceptional use permit, but there can't be any new communities like Lost Valley built unless there is a new land use planning designation, which I'm calling rural residential clusters. And the advantages of being able to have rural residential clusters out here in the rural areas of Lane County include housing security. Currently, the urban growth boundary creates an artificial constraint on the market for housing, that the land values go up because it's become scarcer because of that artificial urban growth boundary that confines all new housing to that region. And all rural housing is expected to be single-family dwelling. So it would help to relax the cost of new housing to allow some residential clusters out in the rural areas. And by having clusters, it maintains a smaller footprint. You could have 20 people living in a multifamily apartment building in the rural area on a much smaller footprint than it would take to put 20 three-bedroom ranch-style houses with their own fire break perimeters and their own driveways. There's also better food security in the countryside, whereas in the city we often have food deserts where it's hard to find sources for unprocessed foods or natural foods. We often go to the farmers markets and the natural food stores. But areas of town tend to only have convenience stores. And sometimes you have to drive further to get to the more natural food stores. And that creates more greenhouse gas emissions, even as one is trying to be more natural. But food security here at Lost Valley is perhaps more obvious in the summertime when the gardens are in full production, but it's not uncommon at all to see people take their salad bowl into the garden and pick a whole bunch of greens for their salad and some tomatoes, chop them up with some cucumbers and just add salad dressing and voila, dinner. Overall health security is also good because out here you're working in the natural environment, doing gardening, walking around the land. There's also water security. And this goes back to the permaculture training that we have here. Part of the permaculture training is to design land features and ponds to retain water on the land so it soaks into the soil and becomes available year-round to deep-rooted trees and also for wells that bring water back up to the surface. Energy security considerations to rural residential clusters. It would be possible for, say, a 20 to 30 unit apartment building to have a cogeneration boiler. The boiler would be wood powered, and it could produce heat for heating the space and water of the building, as well as generating electricity to power the electrical needs of the residents. It would be onerous for one family to try to maintain a cogeneration facility because they are somewhat complex, but if you have 20 or 30 people, it becomes affordable with the economy of scale for that. And currently in this part of Oregon, we have lots of logging operations, and they leave huge piles of slash, which are the branches that are cut off of the trees before the logs are shipped to the lumber mills. And the bark that falls off of the trees, it's all piled into these slash piles that are then burned in the wintertime, just sitting out in the open. So that energy is wasted and that carbon is released back into the atmosphere for nothing, essentially. But if we were running cogeneration facilities here on the land, people could do part of their work for the community, gathering waste wood from the forest operations and bringing it back to the community to be used to generate electricity and heat. It would still be releasing the carbon into the atmosphere, but it would be displacing electricity that was generated by other means from the Bonneville Power Administration and other generation facilities so that more renewable energy would be available for more customers by shifting the burning of the slash piles from the hillsides into the boilers for capturing electricity within the rural residential cluster. It seems like an older one now, but pandemic resilience is another factor to be considered, in that if we put everybody within the urban growth boundaries, we may find ourselves again with a pandemic as we did in 2020 and 2021, where we have to practice social distancing and masking and all of these onerous ways of avoiding being in each other's space, whereas if people are allowed to live out in rural areas, they're already somewhat distributed and taken out of each other's space, so they're not breathing the same air as much. Here at Lost Valley, we actually had a fairly functional pod during the pandemic. We had a kiosk where people checked in at the front gate and took their temperature and logged it. And people were expected to stay in their cabins if they became symptomatic, and then community members would bring them food and drop it off on their porches. And so we had community support for each other so that people who were sick didn't have to go out into the world to meet their basic needs. Wildfire resilience, by having a rural residential cluster, instead of having houses that are tucked away in trees where the fire burning would take the trees and the housing all at once, or instead of having a 3-acre lawn around a 3-bedroom house, typical 3-bedroom house that people get on a ride-on lawnmower to keep the grass clipped. Instead of that, one could have say a 10-acre gardening space for 20 families to maintain together. That would create a very nice fire break around the entire cluster of housing. Just as at Peace Village, we have community work currently only about 4 hours a month, but there are different roles for groundskeeping, common rooms keeping, board, conflict resolution, and so on. People are expected to put in some time, and if they don't make some time for those community tasks, then they pay a certain fee at the end of every 3 months to make up for not doing their chores, so to speak. And I envision that we could have a similar arrangement at Lost Valley, where people living in the cooperative housing would have part of their contract to be to maintain a permaculture hands-on project, and also as a resource for the educational mission, so that when students are on the land in the spring, summer, and fall, they can do tours and come and see the concepts that they're learning about in the classroom actually applied in the community. The idea is to, by reducing that churn of people moving onto the land, learning skills, and moving off the land, we can retain expertise. Another advantage of a redevelopment project here at Lost Valley, in terms of reducing the churn or the turnover of residents, is to address the needs of the elderly and also families. Currently, when we have families here, they often live in cabins and they don't have their own bathtubs and so on. And it's difficult to raise a family, especially with small children, without without a bathtub and the kinds of comforts that come with a typical apartment, at least. So to have more creature comforts for small children makes it more comfortable for families and less stressful. Also, we have a situation here at Lost Valley where the elderly have often been forced by circumstances to move away. We sometimes have difficult times in the winter when utilities go out for a few days at a time, and it's difficult to get around with the snow and ice sometimes. And that makes it risky for an elderly population, whereas if we had a more developed and comfortable housing cluster out here, people could age in place. One of the advantages of Lost Valley that makes it an attractive place to do a pilot project or an experimental project of rural residential clusters is the fact that it already has an exceptional use zoning permit that dates back to the 1970s, when Lost Valley was solely an educational organization And as the new land use laws came into effect in the 1970s, Lost Valley was granted exceptional use to be able to continue using the land here as an educational center as it had for many years in the past. So there are restrictions with the current exceptional use permit that says we can only rebuild buildings in the same footprint of existing buildings. And that leads to certain conflicts in that we don't have the option of building a new building and then dismantling an old building and having the advantage of being able to use the old building while the new building is being constructed. We would have to vacate the old building, do the demolition, and rebuild the building, and meanwhile, during that whole period, go without the rental revenue that we charge for people who live out here and work on the land. So it would be very helpful from an organizational point of view to be able to do a phased approach to redevelopment here. Another consideration is that if you come out to Lost Valley and take a permaculture design certificate course, you'll find that there are 4 zones in a typical permaculture plan. Zone 1 is the housing. Zone 2 is near the housing, the kitchen gardens and small gardens that provide herbs and vegetables for cooking. Zone 3 is fields and trees, more agriculture, and Zone 4 is the forest and relatively wild areas around the perimeter. Currently at Lost Valley, we have most of our cabins built within the forest. So we have a kind of a mixing of Zone 1 and Zone 4. This has some advantages aesthetically. People love to live in the woods and walk out their front door and be among the trees. However, with the wildfires becoming more severe with global warming, there's a risk to having trees around the structures that we're living in. And so it would make more sense to either log the trees, which would impact our aesthetic for many years to come, or rebuild in an area that is already clear of trees, such as the upper meadow that we currently have at Lost Valley that is relatively unused and could make a nice site for a new housing area. We would need to have the Lane County Board of Commissioners revisit, or at least the Land Use Planning Division revisit the current designation that we have and give us a little bit more wiggle room in terms of how we redevelop. Currently, we are approved for up to 150 people living on the land, but we really only have structures for people to, about 30, 40 people to live here on the land. Maybe up to 40 or 50 if we had the dorms completely full at any given time. So we don't currently have enough footprint to house that 150 people that we are, in theory, allowed to have here. And the only way that one can imagine doing that is if we were to build in the same footprint with having like a 4-story cabin, which gets to be kind of ridiculous, especially in the fire considerations are taken into account. So there is, to be able to fulfill what we are currently allowed to do, which is to have up to 150 people here, which is possibly more like what it would take to actually run all of the roles that we have here at Lost Valley, from compost and farming, small business development. There's so many things to be done. We currently have most people wearing at least 2 or 3 hats here. And if we could have more like 100 people on the land, it would be much more relaxed in terms of knowing that all of the functions were covered within the organization. And it would make for less stress for the people living here and volunteering for Lost Valley. So here's the part where we talk about what would need to happen for Lost Valley to transition into a rural residential cluster or a housing cooperative like the Peace Village model. It would require the cooperation of three organizations at least. One is Lost Valley Educational Center, of course. The other is Square One Villages for their expertise in developing communities like this. So far, Square One Villages has only built projects within urban growth boundaries in Eugene and Cottage Grove. And they are working towards doing more, but still within urban growth boundaries. And this would be a first for Square One to do a rural development. But there is a need for low-income housing in rural areas just as there is in urban areas. And it would be nice for people who are on limited incomes to be able to have a choice of living in the city or in the countryside. And often that choice is very important in terms of accommodating people's health needs, because people are often in low-income situations, have disabilities. Oftentimes those are psychological in terms of anxiety, depression, and so on, and living in a country setting is often very healing for them. Lost Valley would need to work together with Square One. Square One has the ability to build multi-unit clusters. Square One also has the ability to structure the development in a way that invites and gathers funding from nonprofit, from foundations that are interested in supporting low-income housing. So for example, with Peace Village, the development costs of putting the 70 units on the land was around $11 million. Of that, all but $2 million was donated or by grants from foundations and government agencies. So the co-op itself only has to carry $2 million in financing and mortgage payments. So that's a huge chunk of the cost taken care of. And Square One Villages has the expertise to make that happen, as well as the connections and contacts. So they would be a great resource. The third organization is Lane County, and possibly the state of Oregon. But Lane County, at least in terms of creating a variance to the current exceptional use permit that Lost Valley enjoys, to expand the project beyond Lost Valley, however, would require the state of Oregon to come up with a new rural residential designation for rural residential clusters. There's an advantage to Lane County to have Lost Valley Education Center continue. We've been here for 35 years, since 1989, and teaching people permaculture all of that time. It's a rare facility, and I think it's a benefit to the community, especially if Lost Valley can have more presence in the larger community as an example of what it's like to live in a more balanced, a lifestyle that's more in balance with nature, with gardening, renewable energy, and nonviolent communication, and all of the other values that we hold dear here at Lost Valley. It's really two different visions of the future. One is the kind of crowded, urban, 15-minute city kind of a vision of what the future should be like, and another is more integrated, humans in nature and acting in cooperation with nature without damaging nature. So the idea of a rural residential cluster is not to just expand the urban growth boundary and let the sprawl out into the countryside. It is to create new covenants and restrictions on the land so that when there is a rural residential cluster, the footprint is not just where the humans are living, but also the area that is under the protection and stewardship of the people living on the land. This is the Oregon winter. It would be nice to show you Lost Valley at its best, which is usually in the winter, spring, and summer. But this is also a way to show you the need for more permanent housing here at Lost Valley by showing you what it's like to be out here in the winter time when the needs for shelter are at their greatest. So brought my headphones from Peace Village, and I use these for noise canceling. I have a autistic member in the family who has taught me the joys of being able to turn off the background sound with noise-canceling headphones. So I wear these in town when I'm at Peace Village just to be a little bit more relaxed. And then I come out here to Lost Valley and it's just nice to hear the birds chirping and the rain falling, a little bit of the wind blowing. And I'd pause and let the people watching the video enjoy it a little bit more, but I think it doesn't come through on the video as well as it does in person. And I'm trying to be aware that every minute spent in front of a computer screen is another minute spent not having one's human needs met in, in a way. So I would just encourage people to get out in nature and appreciate what it would be like to live in nature as we do here at Lost Valley. This is one of my favorite trees here. It is a quince tree. And many people don't know what the quince is. It looks like a large knobby pear, and it's hard like wood when you pick it, but if you cook it down, it has a floral and a sweetness to it, with a floral scent that is just delicious and reminds me of the joys of having more diversity here than we do in some grocery stores. So this is the front porch kiosk at Lost Valley, where we have our mail and package delivered, and this is where people often show up and for the first time and meet people who are waiting for them. I like it because it's a great place to just come on a spring morning or a summer afternoon and meditate. You can just kind of curl up into the cob bench here and enjoy the quiet. Even when there are people coming and going, this is still a much quieter place to be than many places in the city. Hello, Johanny. Good. I know, we're shooting a video right now about the possibility of doing a Square One project here at Lost Valley.
What's Square One?
Square One makes housing cooperatives for low-income people in Eugene and Cottage Grove.
Nice.
And that's where I'm currently living now, is at Peace Village, one of their projects.
Cool. And you think about doing that here at Lost Valley?
That's what I'm thinking. I'm making a little video to just kind of explain why the idea makes sense from a number of different angles.
Oh, cool.
So
I was going to say, you're going to have to fight the county on the permitting laws and what they've permitted.
That's right. We need to be able to go beyond the footprint. I was explaining to people how if you come and take a course in permaculture design, you learn that there's zone 1 where you put your housing, and then there's all the way through zone 4, which is the wilds. And here we have our housing right in the middle of the wild forest, which is
Advertising for us.
so.
Well done.
So we have. I think a goal there is to move towards a more permaculture model where the housing is in a fire break area,
Nice.
and then the woods don't have the housing in it as much. Now we're coming up on the lodge, which is kind of the heart and hearth of Lost Valley in some ways, because that's where the wood stove is. So in the wintertime, if the electricity goes out, people gather in the lodge, run the wood stove, boil tea water on it, and keep each other company. So this is where we have the community meals. We get the setup with utensils, and the kitchen is behind us through those double doors. It's always nice when the wood stove is going in the wintertime. Nice and dry and comfy. This is the solar roller, which is a project with photovoltaics and electric batteries that is used for powering some of our events in the meadow and other ancillary electrical needs. We actually do generate some solar power here on the land. And oh, we have a visitor. How you doing, kiddo? Meow. Well, the pond is in its full glory in the winter season here at Lost Valley. In the summertime, if you came by here, this would be a dry, empty lake bed. There'd be maybe a few mud cracks here and there. But right now it's doing the job it was intended to, which is to collect rainwater so it doesn't run too quickly off the land and down Anthony Creek and downstream to the ocean. This is what I mean when I'm talking about water security. And that if we had a well in this particular area, it would be much less likely to go dry than it would be if there weren't the pond management systems here. This is the charcoal pit where we often gather downed branches and limbs and put them to burn and then quench them with these barrels of water to stop them burning to ash, but to be able to collect the charcoal to add into the soil as an additional natural nutrient for the plants. This is the lower end of the pond system, where the water kind of comes around through tracks and collects here. So it's actually, the water is sinking into the soil in several different places. Some might wonder if the pond system that we have here is really a natural function. Is it, artificially keeping too much water on the land? And it's good to remember that before the 1800s, this whole area had a population of beavers that would create ponds on the land and in the forests that would hold water back and it would soak into the land. So that's actually the more natural condition of this land, would be to have wild animals that would be building dams, creating ponds that would then help keep the soil full of water and wildlife happy and all the plants happy too. So this area is often called the upper meadow, or sometimes the leach field, because it is where the effluents from the septic system do get pumped to work their way into the soil. As you can see, the trees have been taken out mostly, and so this would be a relatively simple area to clear from housing. So here within the urban growth boundary, land is at a premium, and the land use policies have been designed to fill in empty spaces with housing as much as possible to keep housing concentrated within the urban growth boundary. So for our residents, we have 8 raised beds for gardening, and each person can have usually about half a bed. So I have a 4x4 foot garden, which is very small compared to what was available to me when I was at Lost Valley Education Center, where about 50 people live on 87 acres, a much larger footprint, but makes for much more possibility of self-reliance in terms of growing food. And that's a little bit of a difference between the urban housing cooperative and a rural housing cooperative. One of the advantages of new housing construction is that we've been able to make use of the latest technology for heat pumps and air conditioning. We have Mitsubishi mini splits that provide both heating in the winter and air conditioning in the summer. So there's an internal unit with a remote control, as well as these external heat exchange boxes on each unit. And that makes for a very comfortable living space. I have a unique perspective living here in Peace Village, having moved here from Lost Valley Education Center, which is a rural area. So some of the differences I would point out are the small spaces for gardening that we have here relative to what was available at Lost Valley, and the relatively noisy conditions next to River Road compared to the bucolic, peaceful setting of Lost Valley, where the loudest thing is sometimes the wind or the train in the distance. As one who has a stress-related disability, I find that the quiet is very helpful, and I often use noise-canceling headphones when I'm walking around here. So my ideal, I guess not too surprisingly, would be to have something like Peace Village out in the country. And there are a lot of advantages for having what I call rural residential clusters that are outside of the urban growth boundary and tasked with doing stewardship of larger sections of land. So it doesn't just become sprawl, but it becomes a conscious placement of people and labor in rural areas so that people can have synergistic sharing of resources with each other that doesn't happen with current land use planning in the countryside, as well as more self-reliance that it's possible with a little bit more land. Here we are at Emerald Village in the Train Song neighborhood of Eugene. And the point of coming here is to see that just because one does a project with Square One Village doesn't mean that they're locked into the architecture that we have at Peace Village, which is nice, but there's a lot of variety is possible. Here at Emerald Village, there are 22 different units, and it's the first property in Eugene that the city allowed to be developed under the idea that an apartment unit doesn't necessarily have to have shared walls. So we have 22 individual freestanding houses, each representing the style of a different architect. Hi, we're here with my favorite tree on the campus of University of Oregon. It's a Japanese persimmon tree just behind me. And I'm commenting on it because I only noticed it this last fall. I went to college here in the 80s and have lived in Eugene for 30 years. And I think that it's amusing in that some people think that the evolution of great apes with larger brains was partly had the evolutionary pressure behind it so that the apes could find the trees that were bearing fruit at any given time of year in their circles around the land. And I think how evolved have we become where we've got hundreds of students and PhDs walking past this tree just as I did when I was a freshman and sophomore and junior and senior here at the U of O without noticing that there's a persimmon tree, without noticing this wonderful bounty of the land that the campus is on. So there's a little bit of an irony to it there. And a lot of things have changed since I went to college here. Matt Court has been replaced, Hayward Field is different, the Urban Memorial Union has changed. And I thought about what has changed about this persimmon tree. Well, it's obviously going to be bigger than when I went to college here. But I think the biggest change is that I've changed. In living at Lost Valley Education Center for 3 years, went there, I wasn't as aware of the land that I lived on or the natural fruits and vegetables that are there for the eating if you're aware of them. And now I'm back living in town, and I think I'm more connected to nature and more aware of nature now than I was when I went to live at Lost Valley Education Center. And my wish is that future projects for Lost Valley and for Square One Villages and for Lane County will make that connection to the natural world available to everybody who wants it. We're here with my second favorite tree on the University of Oregon campus, actually 4 trees. All 4 of these trees here on the south end of the Urban Memorial Union are ginkgo trees. And ginkgo trees are prized for some of their medicinal properties. And it represents another resource that's just here naturally growing part of the land that I would ordinarily have just walked past and not given a second thought. But now I'm thinking, maybe I could gather some of the leaves this coming fall and make my own ginkgo extract. And so just another example of how I feel like I'm more aware of nature and more ready to coexist with nature in mutually beneficial ways. It's 2025 and we as a society get to make a choice. Do we want to continue to have people being able to choose access to the natural world in addition to the built environment? Or do we want to kind of lock people into the built environment? Because the pressure inside the urban growth boundary is building, and we see buildings going up, and there's a desire to come out. But we want to respect Oregon's values from the past, which says we're going to build out, but not in a way that sprawls, but instead relies on the sense of stewardship of people on the land that they live on. So ideally, we could have a choice for individuals supported, whether they want to live on the land or in buildings like the apartment buildings. And let's see, I'm reminded of a comedy book by P.G. Wodehouse in which Bertie and Jeeves are discussing the likelihood of a plan that involves 3 or 4 different actors coming together at the same time, being a very risky plan indeed. And I think this proposal needs to speak to the aspirations of Lost Valley Education Center, Square One Housing, Lane County, as well as the people that would live in the low-income housing that gets built. As I see it, Lost Valley Education Center has an interest in fulfilling its stated mission of providing low-income housing, which it has partially fulfilled in the past with cabins that rent at below market value, but also have a little bit below market utility in terms of what facilities and amenities people are used to. So far at Lost Valley, we haven't really made it possible for residents to work with Section 8 because the housing has not been conformant to Section 8 housing rules. This project would allow Lost Valley to have housing that conforms to Section 8 because Square One Housing has expertise in building housing that does conform to those standards, and as well as expertise in raising funding for that. Currently, Lost Valley is a little bit of an experimental location from the first place because it has exceptional use designation dating back to its educational roots in the 1970s. It has continued fulfilling its educational mission every year since then and has kept that exceptional use designation. This exceptional use comes with a restriction that says we can only build buildings within the current footprint, and that has raised logistical problems for replacing old structures in that we have to empty them out of the current residence, stop charging rent, tear down the building, rebuild the building, and then move somebody in if they haven't moved away in the meantime and start charging rent again. Whereas if we had the freedom to build outside of the existing footprint, not only could we have more people living there, closer to the 150 that the land use designation currently affords us, but the housing available does not. But we could also better meet the goals of the Permaculture Training Institute. So for Lane County, I sometimes think of the reputation that Oregon and Lane County in particular have if you talk to people from other parts of the country and sometimes even from other parts of the world. That I think perhaps Bill Murray put it well in the movie Groundhog's Day, where he's giving a sarcastic weather report, and he says, and up here in the Northwest, we have lots of big trees. And, it speaks to Oregon's reputation nationally and internationally as a place for trees and rivers and mountains and natural beauty, which we do have, and it appeals a lot. And I think that Lost Valley Education Center as a permaculture training organization has attracted some attention. It's been a finalist in competitions internationally for permaculture intentional community, and it has also been mentioned in at least 1 or 2 books, one by Elliot Page, in which they discussed their training that they attended at Lost Valley Education Center as part of their memoirs. So I think that Lost Valley Education Center has a lot to offer to Lane County as a whole in terms of helping build on that reputation that Oregon and Lane County enjoy, and making the appeal of being able to integrate one's own life with the natural world and living things more of a reality than, say, living in a tall apartment building downtown does, at least to my mind. And the different people may make different choices, but I think the goal that I'm trying to put forward is for individuals, no matter how much their income is, to still be able to choose whether they want to live in the countryside or in the city and have a lifestyle that makes sense for them. Square One Villages also has an interest in providing low-income housing, often to people who have disabilities or other disadvantages. And living in the country can have a positive health effects, especially for people suffering from anxiety, trauma, PTSD, and depression. And I think that should appeal to Square One Housing to make this experiment of developing a Square One housing project in the countryside interesting and worth pursuing to see how it works out. Well, I mentioned the advantages of the Envision project at Lost Valley Education Center, both for the center and for Square One Villages and Lane County. And then there's the fourth community, which are the residents of low-income housing. And I would encourage all three organizations to check in with the people that they serve. Lane County with their constituents and voters, Lost Valley Education Center with a community of people that come for permaculture training and seeking low-income housing in some cases, and Square One Villages in terms of how a rural residential project might fit into the larger goals of Square One Villages to provide a spectrum of housing options to meet the needs of all people who are requiring low-income housing. Thank you.